learners. Please join me today in the session called Community Mobilization and Introduction. My name is Anuprita Shukla and I work at University of East Anglia in Norwich in England. Today I'm going to talk to you about community mobilization. It's going to be a basic introduction to the concept of community mobilization. As I have quickly introduced myself, I'm going to quickly give you an idea of what our objectives are going to be going forward for this session. So the first objective is to understand the key concepts of community mobilization. We will also learn about theory and community mobilization in practice. We furthermore explore various applications of community mobilization in development at large. Towards the end of the session, I leave you with a small exercise where you will design a community intervention for a scenario, imagined hypothetical case. Without wasting any further time, let's go ahead. So, what terms come to your mind when you hear of the word community? Very quickly, can you imagine a few words? Okay. Did you think of a village, a town, a lawyers' collective, a sports club, a trade union maybe? Then we are on the right path. So in essence, community is a group of individuals, and community could be territorial, geographical. Many a times people organize themselves based on culture, their belief system, their ethnicity, and moreover, people also come together as a community of professionals. So in the slide in front of you, I have few pictures. The first is a community, which is territorial unit, a village, a geographical unit. Then there is a picture of a community which live together based on their ethnicity, their cultural norms and belief system, which is a tribal community in Odisha in India. And you have a picture of female farmers, which is a community organized according to their work or job or profession. Now, what does community mobilization mean? So community mobilization has two elements. The first is the local people themselves. We call them local actors. And second, there are external supportive agents. Community mobilization has been conceptualized in various manners. People define it differently in literature, but community mobilization is a transformative organized process in general. So what does it mean? In simpler terms, community mobilization is an organized process with two sets of players that come together to decide upon what local needs exist in a community. I strongly don't like to use the word problems here. So they identify their needs, they come together, they discuss, deliberate, reflect, and they design solutions with an aim of empowering those communities and collaborators towards improved health and well-being. So why is community mobilization a transformative process? Because it has the ability to create an empowering social change. As we go further along the presentation, I will give you quite a few examples of this. But before we go to that, let's stop and understand the basics of theory of community mobilization and a quick history. So this caricature is of Paulo Freire, a famous Brazilian educationalist, thinker, philosopher, activist who revolutionized the entire pedagogy or the educational knowledge system as we know it. He started working in rural areas of Northeast Brazil with majority of the illiterate and poor populations. Most importantly, a majority of them being adults. And based on his work, he has influenced the fields of education, community development, community health, and many more. So we are going to cherry pick today some of his key concepts for this session. The first and foremost concept is of consentization. It is quite a handful. So in very simple terms, it is a process where one is aware of their own social reality. And this is done through reflection and action. So in other words, let's break it down. The process constitutes of two aspects. The first is thinking, so that is reflection. The second is action, doing something about it, right? So three of his most influential books that I've listed here, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, The Politics of Education, and Pedagogy of Hope, talk about various concepts that he has brought forward. In terms of this session on community mobilization, we pick up a strand. So let's say education and opportunity for livelihoods maybe, right? So if that were to be taken as a strand, let's go ahead with a few pointers to understand what this theory of Rare means. So he developed a concept called culture of silence in his Pedagogy of the Oppressed. A culture of silence is a concept which states the nuance or the subtleties of power imbalances and the equality at large, and where people remain quiet. There are multiple reasons for this, which he goes on about. So the essence is to recognize the power dynamics as a community around you, being aware of the social reality that you're in, acknowledging that, talking about it constructively, which means dialogue, engagement, and finding a solution to those sorts of local needs. So for example, there could be a gender element. Let's take an example of domestic violence in a household where a woman gets beaten by her husband, but she keeps quiet about it. Or maybe caste, many examples in India, and class, poor versus rich, or high caste farmers getting access to all government schemes and loans, maybe, we don't know. Then there is age as a factor, which also creates inequality. The cultural norms say that in India, particularly. For example, young people are not able to voice their opinions on important issues that often. Then there is a social status attached around our lives. For example, an Anganwadi worker who is literate, who has a pakka house in village, would have more social status as compared to a low-class farmer woman who is illiterate, right? So the essence of this ideology and theory is that education and opportunities to succeed in life, to make a living, to create an employment and livelihood are not the same for everyone. So Ferrer comes from a lens of marginalized and inequality and illiteracy, and then he approaches furthermore that people have the power to change. So if we reflect, if we are aware of the solutions, if we are aware of the social reality, if we understand and talk about the inequalities in which we live, then we can come together towards a more empowering solution. So now that we have covered what community means, what community mobilization means, let's take a step forward based on the theory. How does community mobilization occur in practice, right? So on this slide, I've listed a few dimensions of community mobilization, which I'm going to give examples of. They are shared concern, a critical consciousness, organizational structures and networks, leadership, collective actions, and social cohesion. So as you see in the slide in front of you, what is shared concern? A very good example is, maybe imagine a farming community and a village which has problems related to electricity and is drought prone. So if there's no electricity, people are not able to pump water in their fields, tanks, and so on, which affects their crop patterns, right? Another example is rural water and sanitation programs, where community have to raise 20% of the grant, contributory grant, and that is a concern. So people need to come together collectively to raise the money so that they can furthermore take the program forward. The second element is critical consciousness. Now this goes back to what I was talking about in my last slide about prayer, and that is reflection and awareness of our own biases, of assumptions, the inequality and the injustice that shapes our lives, and so on. Very common examples for a very long time in India are scheduled caste women not being allowed to enter the places of worships, for example. So when this critical consciousness stirs within a community, there have been protests and there have been um, news reports all over, especially in southern India, where women were given access to some places of worship. Then organizational structures. So there is Gram Panchayat, Tehsil, maybe a Zilla Parishad or cooperatives, and many more. If we talk about leadership element of community mobilization, there's religious leaderships, there's political leaders, formal village councils, informal village tribal councils, the panchayat, and more on. But leadership is not just collective leadership, it could very well be individual leaders as well. And collective actions are one of the key dimensions. So by collective actions, I mean organizing, say, for example, a village festival for a village deity. Then there could be many other collective actions where people come together and start contributing towards construction of a footbridge or a road in village, and so on. So all together, put these things as in place, community mobilization stands on the substratum or the base of social cohesion, which in simple terms means you come together as a community. There's a very strong gelling of community. I have a few examples of community mobilizations across India in various different development themes with examples, which I'll talk you through. So the first is HIV prevention programs. Community mobilization historically has been a very successful approach in HIV prevention programs. A very good example is Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation funded Avahan programs in India, which have used peer educators as their strategy. So what are peer educators? Peer educators are one of the community members who is being trained by the external agents, who has more access to the community. The community members have more trust towards them, and they are literally their peers, as in their friends. So good example is maybe a Sakhi or Didi or Tai in different parts of India. They are called by these lovable nicknames. Then there is Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, which is a sanitation issue. And the program uses a critical mass approach, where we have seen multiple celebrities, political parties, political leaders, and many strong and influential people who approach the larger crowds to come and join them in cleaning initiatives, sanitation drives across the country. Then there are examples of domestic abuse or darubandi, which is alcohol abuse as well. When we talk about development in India, it's well documented that the darubandi is basically a protest by local groups in villages in India. Last but not the least, the integrated child development programs, which use ASHA and Anganwadi workers, are an excellent example of mass level of community mobilization activities towards better health and nutrition outcomes. This is an example of community mobilization in an HIV prevention program, which worked with sex workers community. And as a result, the community mobilization helped the sex workers do advocacy and initiate procedures for getting their ration cards and other social entitlements, for example. There's a link to the booklet and a training module from this project towards the end of the slide. So again, here, various strategies as community mobilization approach were employed, which could be conducting one-to-one meetings or conducting and participating in community religious events, going and talking to stakeholders, and so on. Here's another case study of community mobilization for improved nutrition and health outcomes. So I'll talk you through small steps of this particular example here. A participatory research action was conducted in Odisha, and the key identified local need was to raise awareness of traditional food basket and its nutritive value. So things like training of local researchers, in this case, local youth members, then participatory methods were employed and data collection was done through various participatory methods such as focus group discussions, seasonal calendars, interviews. And the outputs that this approach generated was community profiles being made, which captured and documented the rich traditional food items in the village. Then there are films which were made by local people, local youth groups that captured local recipes from scratch. So this example here is actually of an Anganwadi worker who is locally sourced food is being used for the meals. And then there's a proud kitchen garden owner as well who grows her own herbs. For example, chilies, then she uses tomatoes and some local green leafy vegetables, which are very high in nutrition and nutritive contents, and which improves the overall food consumption in her own family. This picture here shows how the in-house training of local community researchers is being conducted. Like we said in the beginning, there is a need to identify the local issue. Once the local issue has been identified, both groups come together and strategize. So this is part of that step of the community mobilization cycle. Once the in-house training is completed, make sure to pilot sort of your tools, test them in the fields before actually starting the data collection too. The data collection has been conducted or can be conducted for various things based on the issue identified. In this particular example, a women's group is discussing their dietary consumption patterns, their feeding practices for children, crops grown, and so on. And in the picture besides that, you see a one-to-one in-depth interview, and the participant here is talking about food consumption practices. And as we all know, majority of the cooking is led by women in India. So there's a strong focus if we need to improve the consumption practices in order to affect or improve the nutritional well-being of a family. Said this, there are common critiques as well of community mobilization approach. And the critiques are for both theory and practice. I give you this table, which consists of the theme and a few examples. So it's often critiqued that community mobilization has this black and white concept of power. Some people are very powerful, some people are powerless. But that's not often true. Like people who work in the development sector know about this. For example, David Moss speaks about that in one of his famous books, which I have given a link to in the reference section. So when a funding agency goes and starts working, for example, with an NGO or the CBO, people there also have some sort of negotiating power or have some elements of benefit. So in a sense, it's like, a collaborative effort. Then there is often a critique of community mobilization, which says that participation is often tokenistic, which means, let's say, for example, if a women's group is called upon for a meeting in a village about using condoms, for example, for sexuality project. And if we have all the mother-in-laws there who are elderly, while the young reproductive age group daughter-in-laws are not really part of the discussion, what sort of data is it going to generate and what sort of program would be designed based on that? So, there's caste, class, income, life cycle, and many factors. Also identities, sub-layer of identities that form true participation in various community mobilization approaches. Then there is another critique that these programs are like, decontextualized. So in very simple terms, let me give you an example. A big program will come in who wants to create employment for sex workers and rehabilitate them. And they offer them a sewing machine, and you can do tailoring classes and generate income and come out of sex work. Now, often debatable, but the sex worker who earns maybe 2,000, 1,000 rupees a day on a good day by taking clients may not be happy just by doing a tailoring class and getting a sewing machine, which will require almost a month to generate that sort of money. And is it really effective approach? So these whole sorts of like poverty being linked to livelihoods and the larger decontextualization of programs has been debated a lot. Then it is also talked as being Western values dominated, sort of. So a good example is like, most of the HIV prevention programs in India had this approach where one has to come out of their sexuality. Coming out means declaring to the public as being a MSM or a sex worker or a HIV positive person, which carries more stigma and vulnerability. And many times it's more life-threatening too in many situations. For example, in a village, in a very remote village, coming out as a gay person may not be that easy as compared to coming out as a gay person in big cities in India. And the most important critique of all is the whole assumption that any social change is a very smooth and linear process. Linear meaning it starts from A, we will do B, C, D, and then we are going to get a result of E. It's not that easy. For example, a funding agency program that comes together and will decide that we will work with a community or a NGO for 5 years, and we will create this fascinating project, and the entire poverty will go away from this village. It will be all positive social change. But that doesn't happen too often. So I'll quickly summarize what we have covered so far in this session. We started off with quickly coming to identify what constitutes a community, what community mobilization is. We touched upon briefly the theory and history of community mobilization. We looked at various dimensions of community mobilization with examples. We also covered how community mobilization can be applicable in different themes of development sector at large. We also had a brief opportunity to study one of the completed case study products where community mobilization was used as a successful intervention with sex worker community. And then we studied of a case study which showed how community mobilization is being used to improve health and nutrition of tribal communities in Odisha. Now, before we move further, let's take a moment. I have this hypothetical rural community in India where elderly women suffer from high rates of malnourishment. Now, what I'd like you to do is design a community mobilization intervention for them. And to help you do that, I have listed a few questions and a few examples to consider as you go forward. For example, who are the stakeholders? So maybe panchayat, village level SHGs, Anganwadi teacher. So basically develop a community profile as you go along. Include all this documentation, like who are the key leaders that both groups have identified, what is the demography of the village, the status of employment, literacy rate, and so on. Once the identification of local needs has been done, what strategies will be employed and how? For example, would there be a monthly meeting? Is there a need of one-to-one outreach? Is there a need of more weekly interactions or create awareness camps for a regular interval of time? What kind of social structures need to be in place? Maybe a Sas Bahu nutrition working group needs to be established, or youth mandal, or existing formal structures that are in place can be used as well. What resources are needed? Think through those lines. Resources could be financial, very practical level. I've given a few examples. They might need just a supply of jaggery from one of the farmers. They might need free labor contribution from some of the women, men, or storage baskets to keep peanut and jaggery laddus, for example, if that is something they have in mind. Or maybe some money to bring some calcium supplements, or maybe just a vehicle to transport things, Throughout the process, monitor how it goes along, and list all possible challenges that you could think of throughout this planning process, right? So these are a few examples, and you can read up more on it. With this, I thank you so much and happy learning.